Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class, a production of iHeartRadio. Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Holly Fry.
And I'm Tracy V. Wilson.
It's summertime, which for a lot of people means travel time. Historically, summer is when I travel the least, except this year, apparently, because I figure I travel since, we are not burdened by having to pay attention to like school year calendars and whatnot.
Right.
We try to travel when the big travel season isn't happening so we can have it a little more relaxed. But this year, I don't know why, I just ended up with lots of travel. But a lot of people plan road trips for summer getaways. I love a good road trip. I like to drive. So this, of course, has me thinking about roads and highways. And today, I thought it would be fun for a lighter note to talk about a few such roadways from around the Western world that are historically significant in one way or another. All of these also still exist in one way or another. One is quite ancient, and it is still accessible, although not by car. One is an important part of the development of the U.S. It is not Route 66, I'll tell you now. And the third is a little more modern. It still exists pretty much in its entirety. It's actually a road that Tracy and I have traveled on during one of our podcast trips. And we're going to start by talking about what is one of the oldest roads in the world, and then we'll progress through those three chronologically.
The first road we will talk about is the Ridgeway. That's in England, and it's a thoroughfare that's been in use for an estimated 5,000 years, making it the oldest road in Britain. That means really no documentation on its creation. We do know that over time, though, this path became established as a route for farmers, travelers, and military troops. It runs on a chalk ridge through Oxfordshire and southern central England from Overton Hill in Wiltshire to Ivinghoe Beacon in Buckinghamshire. If you're like me and you're like, how long is that? 87 miles long. Calling it a single road or a path is actually a little bit misleading. This wasn't a single road for most of its history. It was a lot of slightly different roads that converged and diverged with one another. One of those is a lower path that would have offered people easier access to water in the springtime. People walking the Ridgeway today might marvel at the incredible views that it offers, but it's probable that this wasn't just about taking in lovely vistas. Also, it was about spotting dangers. And it also offers a relatively dry walking surface, even in inclement weather. So precipitation really drains away from it really well.
Because it is so old, the Ridgeway has been used by a lot of different groups of people at various points in history, and as a consequence, traveling on it today offers access to a look at various moments in history. There is a prehistoric burial mound there called Wayland's Smithy, and it's near the town of Ashbury. Wayland's Smithy, which is on the list of National Heritage Sites of England, was named, it's believed, by Saxons for the Norse mythology figure known as Wayland the Smith. That's a blacksmith who, in his mythological story, escapes enslavement in this whole scheme involving ingenuity and a lot of violent revenge.
But the burial mound is older than the Saxon culture. It was built in the early Neolithic era in two phases. The first is a burial structure that's believed to have been created between 3590 and 3550 BCE. The second phase, which is built on top of the first, came an estimated 100 years later, sometime between 3460 and 3400 BCE. The exploration and examination of this site are fairly recent, happening since 1919. That's when the first reportedly pretty clumsy excavation was mounted. A second and more careful excavation took place in the early 1960s. After that, the site was reconstructed to its original form, and you can visit it today.
A 35-minute walk from Wayland's Smithy along the Ridgeway takes you to the Uffington White Horse, which is a massive pictogram. It's the size of a football field, so when we say massive, we mean it. That is believed to have been created between 1400 and 600 BCE, right on the cusp between the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age. What this horse represents is unknown. There are loads of theories connecting it to various mythical horse figures or gods, but those are only theories, and it too is an English heritage site.
About 18 miles southwest on the Ridgeway from the area where Wayland's Smithy and the White Horse are located is the Avebury Hinge and Stone Circles. On the timeline, the hinge and its circles are right between the two sites that we have talked about already. This hinge was erected an estimated 4,600 years ago, and the entirety of the site's structures are believed to have been created between 2850 and 2200 BCE.
The hinge as it exists today is a bank and ditch that forms a circle. The ditch sits inside the circle that the raised bank creates. And within the hinge, there is also a very large circle of stones. At 1 mile in circumference, it is the largest stone circle in Britain. And there are 2 more smaller stone circles within that largest one. Avebury is a really interesting situation where there is a village that sits partially within this arrangement of henge and stone circles, with people living modern lives in that village immediately adjacent to the elements that make it a World Heritage Site.
There are more interesting stops along the Ridgeway where you can see other historical sites, but we're going back to the Ridgeway itself. We mentioned earlier that it was originally a lot of paths that largely ran parallel and often converged with each other. But that loose group of paths eventually became one clear path, and that was due to England's Enclosure Acts. Sometimes that's spelled enclosure with an I rather than an E at the beginning. Going back to the times when the historical structures we've been talking about were created, the countryside of England was largely open. People worked on farms, but the property lines just weren't as rigid as we might think of them today in most cases. Over time, of course, there were plenty of people who wanted to mark where their property began, and the solution was to enclose that property with hedges or fences. Initially, this started as a practice to keep peasants away from the land that was intended for the nobility. That's something that started with the Tudors. But over time, the idea of private property was adopted through the various socioeconomic levels of the population.
Additionally, as agriculture became a more refined science and focused techniques for developing crops became more widespread, people started to recognize that in some cases it would be really beneficial to cordon off different crops from one another. Farmers wanted to carefully plan and rotate their crops, and having open fields made it kind of hard to fulfill those plans. If you've ever had your own garden, sometimes, plants will just kind of get in each other's business, and they didn't want to do that anymore. And so starting in 1750, the Enclosure Act started to carve out the lines of ownership of what had been open fields in the countryside, also helped carve out different crops. Common property like roads started to be delineated because that common property often abutted areas that were getting enclosed as privately owned. And so starting with the Enclosure Acts in 1750 and through 1830, when the last of those Enclosure Acts were passed, all of those varying little tributaries of the Ridgeway were slowly and artificially eliminated through this legal establishment of property boundaries. Also, just as an aside, the Enclosure Acts also caused a lot of problems. They were very controversial in many ways. They could be their own episode one day. Today is not that day.
Yeah, I feel like that's also something that we at least got a basic overview of in British history class in school. I remember that coming up.
I don't remember it, but that doesn't mean anything. I might have been busy doodling dresses.
As this path became more delineated by these hedges, it became more worn in as a roadway. It had been traversed for centuries, but the consolidation made it really a clear path. In 1973, the Ridgeway became a national trail, and you could walk or bike on it today, or you can even follow it on horseback. You cannot by car, though. Carriages are allowed on some sections, and mobility devices are allowed for disabled people who wish to visit.
It's a little bit early, but we're going to pause here for a sponsor break so that we can keep each section together in its entirety. And the next one is kind of chunky. So coming up, we will talk about the first federally funded road in the United States. Next up, we have the National Road. This U.S. road is also called the Cumberland Road. You'll see why in a second. Sometimes the National Turnpike. It also has an assortment of other names, but it runs from Cumberland, Maryland to Vandalia, Illinois, with many tributaries branching off of it. But that route and many other things about it were matters of great debate, and that's because this was the first road in the U.S. that was funded by the federal government.
Right from the beginning of the United States as a nation, people recognized that this was a big place. Even in the early stages of the U.S., when it was much smaller than it is today, so people understood they were going to need some travel infrastructure. President George Washington talked about this issue as early as 1790. Anybody along the east coast of North America was automatically connected by seaports, but as people started to move farther inland from the coast, particularly into the area known as the Northwest Territory, it became apparent that there needed to be a way to connect these places, both for travel and for transport.
And when we say transport there, we mean transporting of goods. Initially, people counted on river transport to get around, but that didn't obviously connect everyone. There were also mountains that made traveling overland difficult at best and treacherous at worst. There were trails that had been blazed by indigenous peoples, and in some areas, there were military roads that were a little more than trails that had been established during the French and Indian War, which of course was part of the 7 Years' War. But many of the military trails in particular were not made for long-term use, and once they were no longer needed as part of troop movement during a conflict, they were kind of just left to grow over.
There absolutely were roads that had been built or blazed already, or expanded from existing pathways built by indigenous people or migration routes of animals. The most famous of those is probably the Wilderness Road, which was initially cut to open up a trail into Kentucky. The Wilderness Road is credited to Daniel Boone and his company of men. They were commissioned to do this and expanded some already discovered and cut routes. Boone's group was tasked by entrepreneur Richard Henderson with cutting a way through the passage through the Allegheny Mountains, known as the Cumberland Gap, for the benefit of his land speculation company. And that last part is the important bit there. This was a road that was privately funded. It opened up a passage for expansion into the West and was important in growing the footprint of the United States, but this had not been a government effort.
So when Ohio became the 17th state admitted to the Union in 1803, and even when it just looked like it might be, it precipitated a look at the future of the land of the Northwest Territory, and it sharply focused the already known problem that the United States was a country in which some parts of it were really difficult to get to. This isn't something that was an issue of unity. Of course, that was, part of the ideological stuff that was talked about, but really the big driver was commerce. The U.S. wanted the economic benefit of being able to take advantage of the resources that would be accessible through Ohio and the states that would come after it, like fur trading. And it was not as though there were a bunch of Richard Hendersons just throwing money at massive public works projects to get roads built.
In an effort to solve the issue and make it easier to travel within the United States, Congress took steps starting in 1802 to try to make it happen. Money made from the sale of federal land was earmarked for the development of a road from Cumberland, Maryland, to reach the new state of Ohio and then eventually connect to new states farther west as those were established. Cumberland was chosen as the starting point because that was where the Potomac River, which starts on the Atlantic coast south of Washington, D.C., ends. But getting to both the financial and geographic decisions naturally came with some give and take and a lot of debate.
Also, just for clarity, and not anything Tracy did, but I did, we know Ohio not a state in 1802 because it was even before that statehood. But knowing that it was likely, in February of 1802, Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin wrote a letter to William B. Giles, who was a representative from Virginia, who was chairman of the Select Committee on the Northwest Territory. And in that letter, Gallatin suggested a way that a portage road, a road to connect the Northwest Territory to the eastern seaboard, could be funded, writing, quote, that 1/10 part of the net proceeds of the lands hereafter sold by Congress shall, after deducting all expenses incident to the same, be applied towards laying out and making turnpike or other roads, first from the navigable waters emptying into the Atlantic to the Ohio, and afterwards continued through the new state. Such roads to be laid out under the authority of Congress with the consent of the several states through which the same shall pass. The roads will be as beneficial to the parts of the Atlantic states through which they are to pass, and nearly as much so to a considerable portion of the Union as to the Northwest Territory itself. But a due attention to that particular geographical situation of that territory and of the adjacent western districts of the Atlantic states will not fail to impress you strongly with the importance of that provision in a political point of view, so far as it will contribute towards cementing the bonds of the Union between those parts of the United States whose local interests have been considered as most dissimilar.
The following month, which was March of 1802, Giles gave a report to the House of Representatives. It incorporated Gallatin's ideas and cemented the idea that the nation had to be proactive in thinking not just about one thoroughfare, but the future needs for roadways that would be encountered as the nation expanded. On April 30th of 1802, the Enabling Act was signed by President Thomas Jefferson with some changes, including a reduction from 1/10 of the land sales proceeds to 1/20th, that's 5% as road funding. Things were further reduced in an amendment the following year, which set aside 3% of that 5% for creating roads within the state, and then just 2% for the portage road that would connect the Atlantic states to Ohio.
When it came time to decide on specifically where the road would begin, one of the first factors introduced was trade. In particular, what city had the highest volume of commerce moving goods to and from Ohio. Philadelphia and Richmond were both considered, and also those were kind of laid out as the boundaries of how far north and south the starting point should be considered. So Philadelphia in Pennsylvania, Richmond in Virginia. A congressional committee noted that Philadelphia and Baltimore were the chief trade cities and that sites along the Potomac, specifically Georgetown and Alexandria, were just below that. But even further down the list in terms of volume was Richmond, Virginia. But the committee's report also noted that they were dealing with, quote, scanty sources of facts, and that it was entirely likely that those kinds of statistics would change anyway as the country grew and evolved. It kind of sums up to, well, we think these are the busiest centers of trade right now, but that could all change soon. So I don't know, who knows? So in the end, they kind of turned their focus off of just that. And per the report, the committee, quote, endeavored to fix on that which, for the present, will be most accommodating to the citizens of the state of Ohio, leaving to the future benevolence and policy of Congress an extension of their operations on this or other routes and an increase of the requisite fund as the discoveries of experience may point out their expediency and necessity.
They looked at expanding an existing road that ran from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh to a river point and then continuing that road into Ohio from there. Then they looked at a similar plan to expand a road from Baltimore to the Monongahela River, which I have also heard people say Monongahela, so don't yell at us, and then from Richmond to the Ohio River. In each case, distance was considered to calculate how much each of these options would cost. But the final recommendation for the starting point was Cumberland, Maryland, with the logic that, quote, this route will meet and accommodate roads leading from Baltimore and the District of Columbia. It will cross the Monongahela River at or near Brownsville, sometimes called Redstone, where the advantage of boating can be taken. And from the point where it will probably intersect the River Ohio, there are now roads, or they can easily be made over feasible and proper ground to and through the principal population of the state of Ohio.
When the bill that outlined all of this was read on the Senate floor, a second and third reading were requested, and then the committee's bill passed, apparently without much fuss, on December 27, 1805. It had a harder time in the House of Representatives because representatives from southern states felt like their states had been completely ignored in what was important legislation aimed at growing the country's infrastructure. There was concern that the Senate had passed the bill without consent at the state level. After efforts to postpone the bill indefinitely failed and a lot of back and forth, the final bill, which was titled An Act to Regulate the Laying Out and Making a Road from Cumberland in the state of Maryland to the state of Ohio, was finally passed.
This act set up some of the earliest standards for U.S. roadways, including a standardized width of 4 rods, which is 66 feet. This required road markers every quarter mile, plus, quote, at every point where an angle occurs in its course. Today, road standards in the U.S. are by lane width, with freeways requiring 12 feet or 3.6 meters per lane. This also established that the center of the road had to be slightly raised for proper runoff of precipitation. In September of 1805, $12,652 had been earmarked for the national road, with the expectation that these funds would continue to grow with additional land sales. When the bill was moved forward in 1806, the budget was laid out at $30,000.
The bill became law on March 29, 1806, although it had not actually been a sure thing that President Thomas Jefferson would sign it. He had previously stated that he was not confident that road building was within the authority of the federal government as laid out in the Constitution. But he did see that the various centers of trade needed to be connected. Further, he noted that the plan would eventually have to be expanded beyond its initial scope.
From 1806 to 1811, surveying and planning was done for this road, noting where it could take advantage of older existing trails and roads and how they would need to be altered to meet the requirements of the law. Also, where entirely new cuts of road would have to be made. Some of the military trails from the French and Indian War were determined to be usable for this.
Yeah, by usable, we mean like usable to reset.
To do it over.
They couldn't just like connect to them. There was a lot of overgrowth, according to most of the stuff I read. Once the surveying and the route planning was completed, construction began. And this involved a new approach to laying roads because this project was important. The national road needed to be more resilient than the standard dirt road finish that was normally used, right? Like one of the things I read in several different accounts was that wagon wheels would kind of dig these grooves into roads and then you didn't have a lot of options. You had to go where previous wagons went. During an improvement project to the road, which actually took place before it was completed, this included the use of what's called a macadam road. That's a form of pavement that uses broken granite or greenstone with another layer of light stone on top. They're named after the man who invented them, whose name was macadam. Macadam roads are still paved today, but now hot tar or another binder is poured over the compressed broken stone. And today, a macadam road is laid, of course, using heavy machinery, but in the early 1800s, that version required crews of men to break the stone apart with sledgehammers to prepare it for placement. The Cumberland Road also required a number of bridges, and like the roadway, they needed to be built in the sturdiest possible way for longevity and reliability. And that actually resulted in a lot of stone bridges being laid along the route. In areas where the Cumberland or National Road passed through small towns, in a lot of places, it became the main street that served as the community's center, with businesses clustering along it, kind of forming what people would call the main drag or main strip.
But all of that work took years and years. In the first year of construction, a mere 10 miles of road was laid. It took more than 6 years for the road to reach the Ohio River at Wheeling, Virginia, which of course is now part of West Virginia. Congress funded extensions of the road in subsequent years, eventually lengthening it to 600 miles, reaching it then to Vandalia, Illinois. Although an additional expansion to St. Louis, Missouri was considered, this was not funded because it was believed that railroad access to Missouri would make it obsolete.
The National Road's funding remained controversial over the years, the entire time it was being built. In 1833, the burden of cost for the road shifted from the federal government to the states that it passed through. And then there was like a clause that the federal government would handle upkeep of the parts that had been constructed while it was under their auspices. While it was initially intended as a free road to anyone in the U.S., once it shifted to being state funded, tolls were levied in various places to meet the expense. But the national road was an important and reliable way for people to travel, and it did help foster westward expansion. There was a period where railroads caused the use and popularity of this road to drop, but once automobile travel existed, the road's use was once again on the rise, and it experienced a revival both in usage and just in general interest. And because of growing interest in touring via car, the Federal Highway Act of 1921 included provisions for states to have federal aid to build and maintain highways once again. Eventually, parts of the national road became incorporated into U.S. Route 40. You can even plot a history road trip through the National Road Heritage Corridor, which covers about 90 miles of the road's original path through Pennsylvania.
Yeah, sort of like the enclosure acts, the building of all these highways and the effects they had on communities, a totally different story beyond this one.
Mm-hmm. So our last road today is a more modern highway. It's the Sun Motorway of Italy. This is not Italy's first highway, although Italy does get credit for having the first true purpose-built highway in the world, which is commonly called the Lake Highway. That was constructed in the 1920s to make a connection from Milan to the Lake District. That highway was designed by Piero Poricelli, and he pulled off the construction and design of it in just 15 months. You can still drive it, although now it is part of the larger Autostrade dei Laghi. But Poricelli's work on the Lake Highway set the stage for another Italian highway project that wouldn't start for another 3 decades.
In 1954, a huge infrastructure package called the Romita Law was drafted in Italy. In the years after World War II, the country had seen a lot of degradation of its roads and a huge problem with a lack of availability for affordable housing, particularly in densely populated areas. So this law established financial provisions to try to address some of these issues with a 10-year plan for implementation. One of the projects on it was a highway to run from the north of the country down about 2/3 of its length.
So in 1956, the first stone for the highway that was planned to run from Milan to Naples was laid. Its name in Italian is Autostrada del Sole, the Sun Motorway or Highway of the Sun. And it's also just known as the A1, Autostrade 1. Because of its significant length and how much of the country it connects, it's also sometimes referred to as the backbone of the Italian highway system. And it was a huge investment. It was budgeted at 100 billion lire. And over its length of more than 760 kilometers, it's about 470 miles, it connects not only its 2 endpoint cities, but also Bologna, Florence, and Rome. And the whole thing includes 113 bridges, 38 tunnels, and 572 flyovers.
The plans for the Highway of the Sun owed a lot to the Poricelli design of the Lake Highway, along with a good deal of additional engineering. Fedele Cova was head of the Società Autostrada per l'Italia, which was founded as a joint stock company that was publicly owned as part of the Institute for Industrial Reconstruction. The joint stock company still exists today as a publicly owned company, but it went through a lot of changes over the years, including privatization. This is all context so you know why Fedele Cova was in charge of coordinating this project. He's credited with coming up with a plan to make the highway construction simplified, efficient, and beneficial to as many workers as possible.
And that plan that he had that was, pretty new was to break the highway up into sections, like kind of partitioning them off so each of those sections had its own crew. And this meant that work could be done along large stretches of the road simultaneously instead of going like a little at a time. And also that a lot of construction companies had government contracts to bolster employment numbers. And it succeeded in all of that. But unfortunately, as is the case with many large-scale construction projects, there were also, we should note, many fatalities in the process. And we'll talk about how those who died during this construction have been honored in just a moment.
It took 8 years for the autostrada to be completed. When it was officially opened on October 4th, 1964, it was a marvel. It shortened the travel time by car from Milan to Naples from a 2-day journey to one you could make in just 7 or 8 hours. It also stoked the fires of industry. Companies like Fiat saw this as a harbinger of new markets, and they ramped up the production of cars.
Yeah, there were a lot of companies that backed this whole idea because they saw how quickly it could grow their profits and their business, like tire companies and travel companies that were setting up hotels and whatnot. One of the enduring legacies of the A1's engineering and construction is its ongoing association with just really impressive design. As the project was nearing completion, but still under construction, it had the unique honor of having several of its bridges featured at the Museum of Modern Art in New York for an exhibit on 20th century engineering. The works of engineers who had designed sections throughout the entire stretch of the highway were included in the exhibit.
Also, before the highway was complete, an architect named Giovanni Michelucci designed a church to memorialize the workers who had died during its construction. The Chiesa dell'Autostrada del Sole, which is also called the Church of San Giovanni Battista, is a unique and striking structure. It combines traditional and modern design and uses concrete, stone, and copper as its prominent materials. This church is clearly visible from the highway as it passes through Florence, and in some ways it looks like a tent from the exterior, and that's by design. It's intended to beckon travelers who need a place to stop and reflect or replenish spiritually. The interior of the church is just as innovative as the exterior, and it also blends the traditional and the modern, including concrete pillars that are cast to look like trees.
Even after the highway opened, it was home to innovation that continues to echo today. In 1959, the first autogrill opened along the A1. So an autogrill is kind of like a rest stop, but if you're from the US, they're not like our rest areas. They're closer to some other things that Tracy and I will talk about in behind the scenes. Autogrills have food service where you can typically get things like panini or hot plates, and sometimes they even have a buffet. This is also in addition to the candy and to-go snacks and bathrooms and all the things you might see in a convenience store. The first one was a joint venture by industrialist Mario Pavesi and designer Angelo Bianchetti. Today, there is also a company called Autogrill that runs a number of these little rest spaces, but the word is also used as a non-proper noun.
Holly also read a quote on an Italian site called Domus in an article written by Alessandro Benetti that was a translation into English, so it's sort of impressive for its poetic quality. Holly is not sure if this was auto-translated shockingly well or if a human being did this translation and then served it to site visitors based on their locale, but it kind of sums up the way a lot of people feel about the A1. Quote, "The Autostrada del Sole is sometimes a sensible and other times a violent insertion whose transformation potential reverberates well beyond its physical boundaries. It implies a global reorganization of the road network with several national and provincial routes turned from major thoroughfares to panoramic paths. In parallel, settlements with similar urban histories see their destinies and their appeal being redefined on the basis of their distance from the closer toll."
I felt like that not only is a good way to look at the autostrada, but kind of all of these important roads, right? Like where a road goes, so goes growth. And there are a lot of towns who throughout history have been booming places, and then a significant thoroughfare gets installed away from them and they lose their prominence in terms of their importance in trade and whatnot. And others are suddenly like brought into a more industrialized way of life than they may have had before.
Yeah. And I can't speak to this outside of the United States, but in the United States, we also have a long-standing pattern of roads and highways just plowing through neighborhoods, particularly poor people, people of color, in a way that's terrible. It has really just devastated a lot of places.
It's such a problematic and difficult to reconcile duality, right? The idea of connecting to one another, making connecting to places easier is very romanticized, certainly in the US, right? But then that often means that we're ignoring the fact that somebody's got to lose to make those happen in most cases. I am always fascinated by roads and roadways. I definitely grew up in a family where we drove everywhere. So I have spent a lot of time riding the roads of the US. And it is interesting to me the way you will see just, you know, highway that is passing through areas that don't seem to benefit from it, maybe seem to be hurt by it, and in other cases clearly have been helped by it. And all of that also has a subjective angle of what you consider to be a good way of life and a good worthwhile benefit versus the loss. So always food for thought as you travel on your summer trips. I have a fun piece of listener mail because it involves a place I like to travel on my summer trips.
Oh, good.
Which also, in the nerdiest way, which I will explain at the end, is kind of an echo of the things we have just been talking about. This is from our listener, Miranda, who writes, "Hi, Holly and Tracy. I'm a longtime listener to the podcast and first-time writer. I used to drive 45 miles each way to get to my university in undergrad, and I got my Stuff You Missed in History class doctorate while getting my bachelor's degree. I just listened to your episode about popcorn and the behind-the-scenes episode, and I laughed out loud at the description of Holly's R2-D2 air popper. I am now a music professor at a local college in Central Florida, and during the summers, I'm a seasonal cast member at Walt Disney World, specifically Galaxy's Edge. I am a resident of Batu, serving up quick service food. I'm sure Holly is very familiar with katsakas in the marketplace, but we have two types of popped grains, one with salt and butter, a classic with a twist as our salt is blue, and one sweet and savory with blueberry lemon pound cake and sweet chili lime flavors. I had to laugh listening to the episode because I think Galaxy's Edge might truly be out of Holly's Star Wars dreams, including popcorn. I'm attaching my cat tax and my two little old cat ladies. Camellia is our tiny old orange cat. She is a holy terror, and I love her. Serenity is our big old lady brown cat, and she's incredibly snuggly. They are clearly plotting something in this picture. Thanks for all you do, Miranda." Listen, I love little old cats. I have them. I love them. And they are very cute. And I think all cats are always plotting something. Even the ones that maybe aren't the brightest ones seem to always have some kind of plan going on.
Yeah.
So thank you for those. This is also interesting because, Batu and Black Spire Outpost specifically, per the lore, used to be a very bustling stop in space until the space lanes changed.
Mm-hmm.
And now it is more of an out-of-the-way outpost. So it kind of echoed today's discussion a little bit, which made me delighted. And I sure do like going to Batu a lot. I will confess that I don't go to Katsaka's Kettle as much as I might because it has the unfortunate placement of being next to Ronto Roasters, where I go constantly because I have an addiction to Ronto wraps. Thus, my Ronto Roasters tattoo. But I do go to Katsaka's for the very, very yummy, very indulgent coffee drink that they make, which they will also make an alcoholic version. It also has cereal on top of it. It's so good.
Yum.
And I'm going to keep an eye out for you, Miranda, because I have a couple more trips down there planned for this summer. So I'll have my eyes peeled and hopefully we'll run into you. If you would like to write us, you can do so at historypodcast@iheartradio.com. You can also find us on social media as Missed in History. And if you have not subscribed yet and you would like to, you can do that on the iHeartRadio app or anywhere you listen to your favorite shows.
Stuff You Missed in History Class is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.